In the documentary is the West history. They discuss clothes. And something interesting about clothes is that if you look at tribes back in the day, not just tribes, but everybody back in the day, you could easily tell where they were from based on how they dressed. But later, everybody dressed like the West. And this is what they had to say about this. Niall Ferguson in the documentary. What is it about our clothes that other people seem unable to resist? Is dressing like us about wanting to be like us? Clearly, this is about more than just clothes. It is about embracing an entire popular culture that extends through music and movies, to say nothing of soft drinks and fast food. That popular culture carries with it a popular message. It is about freedom, the right to dress or drink or eat as you please, even if that turns out to be like everybody else. This is very important. But what this quote does, it makes it sound like it's all organic, that the West had nothing but good ideas and everybody just wanted a piece. This is not what happened. In fact, Western clothing, to some degree, is not fully Western. If we go back in history and we check why the West dresses the way they do, we will find something completely different. But before we go there, we should look at the clothes that people wore in the 1800s that made them very different from one another. Tribe and all. First of all, something like modesty is something that the West introduced to some places forcefully, because as much as some people like to talk about natural, the natural order, the natural family, the natural this, something they like to ignore is the fact that we live in a very unnatural world brought to us by religions that did not care about nature. For example, let's take Christianity, which was responsible for 90% of these cultures losing their customs because they were considered too native, too wild, no matter how sophisticated they were. The West came through and did business in its own way, which was colonization. Colonization changed everything. As we look at China, they had some of the most sophisticated clothing in the world for really any time. But yet today, they dress like Westerners. Cheap clothes, pants, a shirt, no real effort, even though their history had some of the greatest effort in all time. Japan was the same, and most of Asia, to be honest. Africa had the same thing going. Europe was not an exception either. But this did not change the fact that they had different customs in the way they dressed. So, how did the West force the rest of the world to do this? Well, first of all, they came in there, colonized, set themselves up as the biggest force, and then the individuals who were under them decided that in order to be, if you can't beat them, join them. In order to be sophisticated, they must dress like the people who are dominating them. They must look like them. People talk about television as if it has no ability to inspire and to change the minds of people, but television is one of the biggest things that was responsible for the way people dressed. First, it was suits, and then it became the clothes that we wear today. I mean, let's talk about tattoos for 1 second. Tattoos today, or at least now there's a bit of a reformation about it, but tattoos were considered something that criminals would put on their body. But to be honest, this is something that little girls and people who worship their customs in all kinds of places around the world, from China, Japan, India, Africa, the Vikings, all over, would do. So it wasn't exactly something considered scary or anything. But of course, because of the way the West operated. In our heads, we associated with crime and dirtiness and rebellion. If you refused to get a tattoo in the past, you would be the rebellious person. Today, because you put on a tattoo, you are rebellious. But that's because of this fake individualism that exists in the West. So let's talk about freedom in the way that they advertise it. So in the West, they talk about freedom, but we all know that freedom, especially in the way you dress, does not exist. You cannot rock up to most offices dressed whatever you want to. In fact, that's why most people want to be independent of any job and want to run their own lives. Some can't do it, so they just don't do it. They just go by the rules. But the West never embraced freedom in that way, and it will never embrace it, to be honest. I mean, think of the lip plates in Africa, which that was banned by the Europeans, although the Africans continued to do it. The Native Americans also had lip plates, and also the Asians did it. Think how different that is culturally from anything that you find today. Ear stretching. This would be associated in the West with people like goths and emos and stuff like that, alternative. But in most parts of the world, this was considered very normal. That's because altering the body has always been something humans do. So, why is this bad? Why is it bad that the West told us that smooth skin and covering the body from head to toe is a good thing? Well, that's because those customs told a story. We all talk about the stolen artifacts that are in museums all over the world. And that is bad that they're there. But what about the stolen culture? Remember, in dance, there's stories. In tattoos, there's stories. In clothes, there's stories. And don't you know it, in Africa, the clothes tell a lot of stories. But all of this went away. And this highlighted the type of stories that are told by writing on paper more and more and more and more. If you don't believe me, go find a prisoner today, right, who's marked from head to toe with tattoos, and go read his body and see if it doesn't tell a story. And this is any country, pick a country. This is because when you don't have an alternative, adornment plays its own role. Whereas back in the day, it was just customary, it was default. Today I see all these studies about how men behave and women behave, and they say, hey, we've got multiple samples from around the world. But really, these samples are coming from one place. They're coming from Western culture. Because again, if you look at these cultures, they look nothing and behave nothing like Western culture. And so you are not getting a full sample of human behavior. You're getting a full sample of a cultivated behavior in one certain way. But let's go back to something I said earlier. Why does the West dress the way that it does today? Well, it's easy for us to think, well, pants, that's the West, right? Definitely not. The West had several types of clothing throughout its history, even in its Christian age. They used to wear tights, they used to wear these frilly clothes, and then they used to wear all kinds of bright colors, at some point embracing black as a standard for, the rich. And then also they used to not care that much about how some women were dressed if they were poor, but had a general idea of modesty and all this other thing. But then there were places like Islam, which completely went the other way and said, no, modesty is the biggest concern, and every woman from top to bottom should be embracing that. And the people in the world who saw this and realized that they needed to be way more serious about their religion, they did this. They put this in place. Pants obviously are from the Middle East long time ago. In fact, the West used to consider pants very feminine. When they saw the Persians and other groups wearing them, they thought that they were very girly. Remember that thing about nature? Men have beards, that's natural. But in the modern world, you have to shave off your beard to look clean. This is one of the reasons why, if you look at Islamics, they tend to have giant beards. But in the Bible, it literally says, does not nature itself tell you that having long hair is a bad thing for a man? Completely different than what other cultures embrace. Now, this does not mean that nature is the top decider, but that you hear this argument a lot by people from the West about nature. I mean, I'll give you one argument that they use about nature, which is naturally men are warlike and women are not. Therefore, it should be not there. It should not be a thing where women go to war and men don't. Now, this would be a good argument if it was completely true that men were built for war. We know that a lot of men are not built for war, and if you don't believe me, go to the prisons and find out. There are men who are built for wars, but there are also women who will build brutally for war. And I promise you, you would rather stand there with someone who is willing and able to fight and able to survive stuff like that than you would be fighting with some guy who's a pure coward.
May 1976, when we had retreated from all the towns, we had to meet somewhere to try to reorganize. We were 2,000 men. But immediately we were attacked by Cubans, by Russians, and by MPLA, and we were pushed for 4 months. And from May, in October, when we reached a safe place in Kwele, we were 64 persons. Other people from 2,000, the rest of the people were died, they were killed. Others, I think, because of starvation, also they died. And I think in the 64 that have survived, I have to admit that most of them were women. Women resisted much more than men. And men, also some few young men are here, but women have resisted much more than men.
But that's neither here nor there. By the way, all of these people who are built for war are rare indeed, because human beings are not built for war. Human beings are built for hunting, surviving, and basically family and stuff like that. But who cares? Nature is one thing, culture is another. Let's talk about something very interesting about this cultural separation between male and female, which we see in almost every culture. There's obviously customaries about the way people should behave, and again, this is one of the things that is lost. How do you respect someone who's female and older? How do you respect someone who's female and younger? How do you talk to someone this way? And how do you do this? The West has sold this idea of individualism to the point where respect does not matter at all. Which, again, I'm not saying I'm completely against them trying to say that a person who has worked hard is the person who deserves the most amount of respect, but it seems like in the West there is none of that. It's replaced with freedom of speech, at least in America, because for some reason America is the stand-in for the West. And I don't even doubt, I don't even see why we would go against that, because clearly, of all the Western nations, that is the one that most people praise. Funny enough, this Western nation is made by people who would not themselves consider themselves as Western as, people in Europe. So let's go back to other things. Okay, so t-shirts. If you believe that the Western people invented t-shirts, then yeah. If you believe that they were wearing shirts and they weren't just wearing anything that they used to wear back in the day, then yeah, that's your problem. I will tell you again that it was Christianity, a non-Western religion. In fact, Christianity is a African religion with Middle Eastern influence and then some Roman influence because it was founded under the Roman Empire and then altered under the Roman Empire. So it's a fusion of three different cultures taking things that they liked. And even the way the Romans practiced it was not the same as what it would later be practiced around the world. But this religion is what's responsible for the death of all the customs. But why cry over spilt milk? Well, it's because when it comes to history, we cannot piece the real history of human beings because a lot of it was taken away directly on purpose. It's not like it was some kind of accident. I'll give you an example. There's something called cultural diffusion, which people who are historians look down upon it as if it's like the stupidest thing ever, where people talk about the fact that you can take cultures that are completely separate from one another and join them together because their customs are so similar. I'll give you an example. The Judeo Christian Islamic faiths, they're similar, right? And their similarities means that you can draw a through line between those three religions, even though they themselves consider themselves completely different cultures. It doesn't matter. They're part of one bigger culture. And this is why some people mistake the word culture for meaning something that people are doing on purpose. But culture is everything you do. I remember I watched some video on YouTube where someone was quoting Morpheus, who said,
And so we are directed and we are justified in how we operate, live, and behave. Okay. Now, one of the ways I like to look at culture is much as how Morpheus in The Matrix described the Matrix. He might say, culture is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now in this very room, you can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. Culture truly does permeate every aspect of our lives. And furthermore, in many ways, it's quite invisible. Or if it's visible, we're so used to seeing it that we don't see it anymore.
this is a very important point because we are swimming in it right now. One of the quotes that I remember making up is this one. The most important part of the word culture are the first four letters. It will tell you exactly what some people want it to be and have a zealot production about it. But in real life, culture is everything you do. When you're walking, that's culture. When you're talking, that's culture. If you bow or shake hands, that's culture. If you choose to run, if you choose to ride animals, if you choose to eat dirt, not. If you choose to help the poor or not, all of that is culture. But we do not see every single thing that we do as culture because we have been removed from our original cultures. And we are now living in a world where we see culture as merely decisions made on purpose to the value of the community. But in real life, culture didn't have to bring value. Most cultures brought value anyway, but they don't have to. Some people like to argue that, okay, culture helps human beings navigate in a way that is natural and it's mixed together and it brings value and all that stuff. But there are cultures in this world that used to commit infanticide periodically. How did that help? Especially if you consider the fact that having kids was difficult anyway in the past. Let's talk about something else. Since the theme of this was adornment, then it must be said that there is nothing less adornment than being stark naked, which is almost never seen around the world, but it is seen. So the story goes that Adam and Eve were living in the jungle, and then one day they ate of the fruit of knowledge, and suddenly they are aware of their nakedness, and they decided to put on clothes, and God asked them why they put on clothes. This is the justification for why you should not be walking around naked, because it's something that they did prior to the knowledge. Now, that knowledge was brought forth by Satan, the serpent. So, why is that knowledge important? This story is broken down by the fact that most human beings, like I said, were not modest outside of the religions of Christianity. But if you go and look at the areas with snow, or the extremely desertified areas, the deserts, people are overdressed. This story was merely to justify why they dress the way they do already. And of course, Christianity was created in deserty areas. In the ice, of course, we see the Yupik Eskimos and all these other type of people who live in ice areas, and they're overdressed as hell. But over there, it's appropriate for the temperature. In places that are hot, people dress less. That's why at the beach, people prefer to wear these speedos and bikinis and shorts and whatever, because of course it makes a whole lot of sense. And the West, at some point, when they were still high on their Western ideologies, they forbade certain things like this. But then when they realized that they were being ignorant, they gave it up, calling things like the bikini as like the tribes they had seen, even though this costume was worn all over the world. Interestingly, this is true of a lot of fashion seen all over the Western thing, where you see suits which are sort of modeled on some of the Middle Eastern clothing. You see these big dresses and stuff like that, a lot of them utilizing Chinese silks and cottons. You see plumed people, they were wearing these feathers on their hair, but they go crazy with it after they run into Africans who used to plume their head. Now, people plume their head all over the world, but the type of pluming that you see in Africa that they liked was the one where they used all black feathers, ostrich feathers. And what type of feathers did they use to plume themselves, especially when they were dressed in all black? And then, of course, they got rid of all of those tights and the plumes and all of that, and they decided that they're just going to be wearing simple clothing built for architecture and simple work, simple jobs. And it got more and more into that level. This was what the episode was about in the Is the West History. Is there any way to change things and set them up in such a way that we could bring back the cultures? I mean, think about it. The human body used to be a book. You could just read the person. But today, it's all gone.